The U.S. government's own archive admits that 84% of America's largest land giveaway never reached the families it promised. What I found when I dug deeper will change how you see American history forever. Wait, it gets worse. 3 laws, 6 weeks, 1 president, and then a century of records mysteriously vanished in a fire. Stay with me because this timeline is insane. You won't find this on some conspiracy website or fringe internet forum. This comes directly from the National Archives, the United States government's official historical record keeper. Buried on their page about the Homestead Act is a single sentence that most Americans will never encounter. It reveals that between 1862 and 1904, the government distributed 500 million acres of land, but only 80 million actually went to homesteading families. I had to read that 4 times before I trusted my eyes. Then I grabbed a calculator. That means 420 million acres, 84% of the entire program, ended up somewhere else entirely, not with the farmers and pioneers we learned about in school. It went to land speculators, cattle barons, mining operations, lumber companies, and railroad corporations. The government's own website confirms this failure rate. The Homestead Act of 1862 occupies a sacred place in American mythology. President Abraham Lincoln signed it into law on May 20th of that year. The promise was simple and revolutionary. Any U.S. citizen could stake a claim to 160 acres of public domain land, cultivate it for 5 years, and own it outright for just an $18 administrative filing fee. The very first claim was submitted at the stroke of midnight when the law took effect, January 1, 1863. A man named Daniel Freeman filed in Gage County, Nebraska, after persuading a land office clerk to open the doors early so he could complete the paperwork before leaving for military service. It's the kind of origin story that belongs in legend. The law appeared remarkably progressive for its time. Formerly enslaved people could file claims. Immigrants who had declared their intention to become citizens could file claims. Women who headed their own households could file claims. For the first time in human history, ordinary working people could acquire land simply through their labor, without aristocratic birth or massive capital. The impact was enormous. More than 25,000 Black Americans relocated to Kansas alone during the 1870s and 1880s as part of what became known as the Exoduster movement, seeking the opportunities promised by this legislation. Today, roughly 93 million Americans, approximately 1 in every 2 people in this country, can trace their family's land ownership, accumulated wealth, and economic foundation directly back to this single piece of legislation. Which makes it even more critical to understand what actually occurred when the government's own documentation shows that 84% of distributed land bypassed families entirely and landed elsewhere. When you begin examining that discrepancy closely, what emerges isn't just scattered incidents of corruption, it's a pattern so systematic it demands a different explanation altogether. The legislation was structured to fail from the beginning. That's not my opinion. The National Archives itself describes the law as written with such deliberate ambiguity that it practically invited fraudulent claims. Consider this example. The act required homesteaders to construct a dwelling measuring 12 by 14 on their claimed property, but the legislation's authors never specified whether that meant feet or inches. Speculators exploited this immediately. They built miniature structures, tiny wooden boxes measuring 12 inches by 14 inches, placed them on a corner of the property, then filed legitimate claims for 160 acres. The General Land Office, the federal agency responsible for investigating and preventing this fraud, was deliberately kept underfunded. It couldn't hire sufficient inspectors to monitor its scattered regional offices across the vast western frontier. The investigators it did manage to employ were, in the archive's own language, frequently susceptible to financial inducement. There was another loophole equally devastating. The law allowed anyone to bypass the 5-year residency requirement entirely by paying $1.25 per acre after just 6 months of nominal occupation. This provision was called commuting a homestead. Speculators weaponized it constantly. They'd file a claim, wait the minimum 6 months, pay $200 for 160 acres, and immediately resell the land at profit. Historian Paul Wallace dedicated decades to documenting this systematic pattern. He concluded that instead of creating a nation of independent family farms, the Homestead Act triggered what he termed a ruthless competition for land acquisition and resale, in which well-connected speculators consistently emerged victorious. But the fraudulent claims are just the visible surface. The real question is where those other 420 million acres actually ended up. 6 weeks after signing the Homestead Act on May 20, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1st. The very next day, July 2nd, he signed the Morrill Land Grant Act. 3 separate pieces of legislation in a span of 6 weeks. Together, they redistributed more territory than most military conquests in history. The railroad companies alone received more than 175 million acres of public land between 1850 and 1871. That's larger than the entire state of Texas. The Northern Pacific Railroad was granted 40 million acres. The Union Pacific received 19 million acres. The Southern Pacific got 18 million acres. These weren't loans or investments. They were outright gifts with no repayment terms. The railroads then immediately began selling this publicly given land to the very settlers who were supposed to receive it for free. They established recruitment offices throughout Europe, advertised heavily to attract immigrant families to America, and sold them the land the government had just handed over at no cost. The Library of Congress preserves documentation showing how railroad companies produced deliberately distorted maps that misrepresented their land holdings to make the parcels appear more fertile and desirable than reality. Here's what stays with me. Even today, throughout many Western states, the largest private landholders remain the corporate descendants of those original railroad companies. The land was never reclaimed. It never returned to public hands. The Morrill Act operated on the same principle for educational institutions. It allocated each state 30,000 acres per congressional representative to fund the establishment of colleges. More than 10.7 million of those acres were taken directly from the territories of over 250 tribal nations in 15 states. Cornell University alone received nearly 1 million acres confiscated from 230 different tribal nations in 15 states.
A Pulitzer Center investigation documented that over 500,000 acres distributed through the Morrill Act remain under state ownership for university benefit today. In fiscal year 2019 alone, those retained land parcels generated at least $8.6 million in revenue. For more than a quarter of those parcels, not a single dollar has ever been paid to the people who originally inhabited them. 3 pieces of legislation, 1 summer, 1 president. The Homestead Act provided the moral narrative, the story of opportunity for ordinary families. The Railroad Act and Morrill Act delivered the actual land to corporations and institutions. But none of this redistribution could happen unless someone first addressed the people already living on that land. Now, a reasonable observer might argue that land fraud occurs in every historical period, that railroad companies needed financial incentives to construct critical infrastructure, that universities required funding mechanisms to expand education. All valid observations. If this were merely a story about bureaucratic inefficiency and corporate self-interest, it would be a familiar tale we've heard countless times. But the Homestead Act didn't distribute empty, unclaimed land. It distributed land that first had to be emptied, and the machinery constructed to empty it is where this account shifts from frustrating to something I still struggle to fully process. The Dawes Act of 1887, named after Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts and signed by President Grover Cleveland on February 8, 1887. On its surface, the legislation claimed to benefit Native Americans by introducing individual property ownership. Each head of household received 160 acres, the exact same allocation as the Homestead Act. That parallel wasn't coincidental. Everything remaining, every single acre not assigned to an individual, was immediately classified as surplus and opened to white settlement. In 1887, Native Americans collectively held 138 million acres of treaty-protected land. By 1934, when this policy finally ended, they retained only 48 million acres. 90 million acres had vanished, two-thirds of everything. Approximately 90,000 Native Americans, representing two-thirds of the entire indigenous population, were rendered completely landless. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado opposed this legislation in 1881. His words are preserved in the congressional record. He stated plainly, "The real objective is to access Indian lands and open them for settlement. The provisions claiming to benefit Indians are merely pretexts to seize their lands and occupy them." He said this publicly, on the record, before the law passed, and Congress passed it anyway. The mechanism was elegant in its devastation. After allotments were distributed, a 25-year trust period would eventually expire. The land then became subject to state and local property taxation. Most native allottees had no cash income and no experience with the tax system that had been imposed upon them without their consent. They couldn't pay. The land went to tax auction. According to researchers who studied this period extensively, white buyers were literally waiting in line for properties to enter forfeiture status. The Dawes Act also created what became known as checkerboarding. Native parcels were deliberately scattered and subdivided, sometimes across different county jurisdictions, with white settler parcels inserted between them to fill the gaps. Managing land that had been fractured into such a disconnected patchwork became nearly impossible. Tribal governance over these fragmented holdings turned into a logistical nightmare, by design. The act didn't even provide farming equipment or agricultural training to the people it claimed to be converting into independent farmers. When asked whether allottees would receive seeds and tools, Senator Dawes himself expressed uncertainty. He stated, "Whether Congress will be generous enough to provide him with a proper start, I cannot say." This wasn't an unintended side effect. This was the precise mechanism that converted 90 million acres of treaty-protected land into homesteads, railroad grants, and corporate holdings. But you cannot simply take people's land, not really, not permanently, unless you also sever the chain that connects them to it across generations. In 1879, a white cavalry captain named Richard Henry Pratt established a school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. His educational philosophy, stated openly at a national conference in 1892, consisted of 7 words: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Children as young as 5 years old were removed from their families. Their hair was cut. Their names were replaced with English names. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages under threat of punishment. Between 1819 and 1969, the federal government either directly operated or financially supported 408 boarding schools across 37 states. A 2022 Department of Interior investigation identified burial sites at more than 53 of these institutions. The initial report documented over 500 child deaths. The department estimated that the government spent $23.3 billion in inflation-adjusted terms maintaining this system. I need to be honest about something. When I began researching the Homestead Act, I expected to uncover a story about land fraud and political corruption. I did not expect to discover a parallel system specifically designed to remove children from the same communities whose land was being systematically taken. But the timeline cannot be disputed. The Dawes Act fragmented the reservations in 1887. The boarding school system was expanding aggressively throughout the 1880s and 1890s. The Homestead Act was simultaneously delivering the seized land to new claimants. The same government, the same decades, the same people bearing the consequences. And then there's Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation had been forcibly removed from their eastern homelands on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Approximately 4,000 people died during that forced march. The survivors were explicitly promised their new Western territory would remain theirs as long as grass grows and water runs. By 1893, the government had decided not to wait any longer. On September 16, 1893, a rifle shot echoed across the prairie at precisely high noon. More than 100,000 people surged forward simultaneously to claim portions of 6 million acres of Cherokee outlet land. 42,000 individual homesteads were staked in a single afternoon. The heat was so extreme that multiple participants collapsed from heat exhaustion. Tempers flared violently as men competed for position with wagons and horses. Some individuals who had infiltrated early, called Sooners, had already claimed the most desirable land before the official starting gun even fired.
The government had purchased the land from the Cherokee for approximately $1.40 per acre after first eliminating their cattle grazing leases through presidential proclamation. Decades later, the Indian Claims Commission ruled that the sale had been conducted under duress and the land had been severely undervalued. They awarded $14.7 million in compensation, but the land never came back. It never does. This wasn't even the first land run. In 1889, 50,000 people raced for 1.9 million acres. In 1892, 4.3 million acres of Cheyenne and Arapaho territory were opened. Each land run operated under Homestead Act provisions. Each run utilized the same mechanism: treaty-protected land declared surplus, then repackaged as American opportunity. There's one more element I keep returning to: the 1890 census. It was the most detailed population census ever conducted in America up to that point in history. It tracked immigration patterns, naturalization records, property ownership, family composition, military service records, even disability status. It was also the first census to officially declare the American frontier closed. The census superintendent wrote that the unsettled area has been so fragmented by isolated settlements that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line anymore. That declaration fundamentally changed how America understood itself as a nation, and then the census vanished. In January 10, 1921, a fire erupted in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. Approximately 25% of the 1890 census was destroyed outright. Another 50% was damaged by water and smoke. The cause was never officially determined. Investigators considered a discarded cigarette, faulty electrical wiring, and spontaneous combustion of sawdust accumulated in the building's carpentry workshops. And here's what most people never learn. The 1890 census was the first for which the government did not require backup copies to be filed with local offices. Previous censuses had built-in redundancy. The 1890 census did not. One copy existed, and it was stored on pine shelving outside the fireproof vault, directly adjacent to a carpenter workshop filled with sawdust and wood shavings. Think carefully about that. The 1880 census was secured inside the vault. The 1900 census was stored in a completely different building. The 1890 census sat unprotected in the most flammable room in the entire facility. The damaged records sat in a warehouse for over a decade. Then, on February 20, 1933, President Herbert Hoover laid the ceremonial cornerstone for the new National Archives building. One day later, Congress authorized the complete destruction of all surviving 1890 census records. One day. The building, explicitly designed to preserve America's historical records, was christened the same week the government destroyed the census that documented the single most transformative decade in American land ownership history. 99.9% of the records are gone, 63 million people erased from that year. If you have ever attempted to trace your family history before 1900, you've encountered this wall. 1880 exists, 1900 exists, 1890, the decade of the Dawes allotments, the boarding schools, the Oklahoma land runs, the railroad land grants, is the one decade you cannot see. Maybe I am constructing connections where none exist. Maybe these are separate policies with separate motivations, enacted by different people across different time periods. Maybe the fraud in the Homestead Act was merely administrative incompetence. Maybe the railroad grants were simply pragmatic infrastructure investment. Maybe the Dawes Act was genuinely intended to help. Maybe the boarding schools represented misguided idealism. Maybe the census fire was unfortunate bad luck. Maybe the fact that all of these things occurred simultaneously to the same populations is a coincidence requiring no further examination. I have considered that possibility carefully, and I keep returning to the mathematics. 500 million acres distributed, 80 million to homesteading families, 175 million to railroad corporations, 10.7 million to universities, 90 million taken from tribal nations through allotment, 428 boarding schools, 1 destroyed census. Those aren't disconnected facts, they're an accounting ledger. So what does this mean for you personally? 93 million Americans descend from homesteaders. That inheritance is real. The farms were real. The labor was real. The families that built lives on that land were real. But so was the system that made it possible. The law was written with deliberate loopholes. The enforcement agencies were underfunded intentionally. The people already occupying the land were removed through legal instruments, boarding schools, and treaty violations. The records documenting the transfer were destroyed, and 420 million of the 500 million acres ended up not with families, but with corporations, speculators, and institutions that still control much of it today. I'm not claiming homesteaders were villains. They were participants in a system designed to use them as the moral justification for something much larger. The land beneath your feet has a history. Every property deed traces back to a transfer. Every transfer traces back to a policy, and every policy traces back to someone's decision about who deserved to own the land and who didn't. The question isn't whether this happened. The government's own archives confirm it. The question is why we were taught that the Homestead Act was a generous gift when the numbers reveal it was something else entirely. And what else from that era were we taught to remember one way when the evidence tells a very different story?